The morning her aunt died, Clara Holt was standing in the parking lot of a grocery store she could barely afford to shop in, counting the last of her cash in the cold. $43 and some change. She had to choose between the electric bill and the week's groceries, and she stood there so long in the wind that her fingers went numb before she made her choice. She put the groceries back. She paid the electric bill. She drove home to a house that felt emptier than usual, fed her 2 kids cereal for dinner, and was already in bed when her phone buzzed with the news. Aunt Ruth was gone. No illness, no long goodbye, no hospital chairs or hushed conversations in hallways. Ruth Calloway had simply gone to sleep in the house she had lived in, alone for 31 years, and she had not woken up. The neighbor who found her said the television was still on, tuned to the evening news, and that a cup of tea sat on the side table, half finished, still warm enough to suggest she had only just set it down, as if she had meant to come back to it. Clara sat in the dark of her bedroom and held her phone with both hands. She didn't cry right away. She stared at the ceiling and counted the water stain in the corner that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She listened to her daughter turn over and sleep down the hall, and her son murmur something quiet and unfinished. Then the tears came, not because Ruth had been a perfect woman or a constant presence, but because Ruth had been the one person in Clara's life who had never once looked at her struggling and said the wrong thing. She had only ever said, "Keep going." Oh, and that had been enough. Ruth Calloway had lived the way a lot of old women in small southern towns live, quietly and without complaint. She had never married. She had worked for 40 years as a seamstress, first in a textile factory outside of Greensboro, then from her home when the factory closed and her knees made it impossible to stand for 8 hours a day. She had sewn curtains, wedding dresses, prom gowns, and choir robes for the better part of her adult life, and she had done it all from a single back room in her narrow 2-story house on Calloway Street, a house she had inherited from her own mother and never bothered to modernize. The walls were the same pale yellow they had been painted in 1974. The kitchen had a linoleum floor that buckled near the refrigerator. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and where a support post had been replaced but never quite leveled right. Clara had spent summers in that house as a girl, sitting beside Ruth while she worked, learning the names of things: the bobbin, the presser foot, the feed dog, the throat plate. She had learned which thread weight belonged to which fabric, how to hold scissors without fatiguing her wrist, how to press a seam without scorching the cloth. Ruth had never tried to teach her those things in any formal way. She simply worked, and Clara simply watched, and the knowledge passed between them the way things pass between people who share a quiet understanding of each other. The funeral was small, the way Ruth's life had been small, not in a diminished way, but in the way of a life that had not needed to take up more room than it required. There were flowers from the church, 3 pews of neighbors and old friends, a pastor who had known Ruth for 2 decades and spoke about her with the kind of genuine warmth you couldn't buy or manufacture. Clara sat in the front row with her children, Maisie, who was 9, and Jonah, who was 11, and she held their hands through the whole service and did not look at the rest of her family, because she already knew what was coming, and she didn't want it to start before they had finished burying Ruth. It started the next morning. Her cousin Dennis arrived at the house before the coffee had finished brewing. He was the oldest of Ruth's nephews, a big man with a voice built for parking lots and arguments, who had driven 3 hours from Charlotte, not out of grief, but out of the particular urgency that some people feel when an estate becomes available. That he came in through the back door without knocking, set a legal pad on the kitchen table, and said, "We need to talk about the property." Clara's brother Marcus arrived an hour later. Then her cousin Trish, who had not spoken to Ruth in 11 years over some disagreement about a quilt that had been passed down incorrectly, or not passed down at all, depending on who you asked. By noon, Clara's childhood home, the one Ruth had left to her entirely, not split, not divided, but left in full to Clara, as stated clearly in a will that the attorney had read aloud with the particular exhaustion of a man who knew a fight was coming, was full of people speaking loudly and simultaneously about what should happen to its contents. The will had been a surprise to everyone except Clara, and even to her it had been a surprise in the way of something you didn't dare believe until it was already true. Ruth had loved her nieces and nephews in her own measured way, but she had left the house and everything in it to Clara alone, because as the attorney explained in language that could not be misinterpreted, Clara was the one who came. She was the one who visited on holidays without being asked. She was the one who drove Ruth to her eye appointments and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours without complaint. She was the one who had called every Sunday evening, consistently, without fail, for 11 years. Dennis did not take this news well. She was confused, he said, not to the attorney, but to the room, as if the room could overturn the legal document lying on the table. She was old. You don't leave a whole house to one person when there's a whole family. That's not how it works. The attorney, calmly, explained that it was precisely how it worked. Clara didn't argue with Dennis. She thanked the attorney, folded her copy of the will, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket where she kept things she needed to protect. The pressure started that same evening and didn't stop for 2 weeks. Phone calls and texts from family members she barely knew, cousins 3 times removed, people she remembered vaguely from funerals and Christmases, all of them with the same message delivered in different tones. You should sell the house. You should split the proceeds. You should be reasonable. You should think about the family. You should understand that keeping it all for yourself is selfish. And Clara, think about it. You can't afford to fix that house up anyway. You don't have the money. You never have. What are you going to do with it? She had no good answer for that last part, because it was true. The house needed work. The roof over the back bedroom had a soft spot that would need replacing before spring. The plumbing was original and tired in the particular way of pipes that had been holding on through sheer stubbornness rather than structural soundness. The furnace made a sound every morning that Clara described to herself as the sound of a very old man trying very hard to get out of bed. And Clara had $43 to her name, and 2 children, and a job at a medical billing office that paid her $31,000 a year before taxes, which was enough to survive on in theory and not enough in practice. But she didn't sell, or then she did not split. What she did was take 2 weeks of vacation time she had been saving for something she could never quite afford. And she drove to Greensboro with her children and her determination, and she began the work of learning what Ruth had left behind. The house was full, not in a hoarder's way, not cluttered or chaotic, but in the way of a woman who had lived in the same space for 30 years and accumulated the steady residue of a life lived carefully and without waste. Shelves of fabric, neatly folded and labeled. Boxes of thread organized by color and weight. Drawers of buttons, zippers, hooks, and snaps sorted by size into small glass jars that caught the afternoon light and turned the back room into something that looked briefly like a stained glass chapel. Books on tailoring, on pattern drafting, on the history of textile manufacture. A collection of thimbles on a small wooden rack beside the window. Some silver, some bone, some painted with tiny landscapes. And in the center of the back room, on its own table, positioned beneath the best natural light in the house, as if it had been placed there with intention and never moved since, was the sewing machine. Clara had known it her whole life. She had watched Ruth bend over it for hours at a time, feeding fabric through its throat with the practiced patience of someone for whom precision was not an effort, but a nature. It was a singer, old enough that the model number meant nothing to a person who didn't already know what they were looking at. The body was cast iron and black lacquer, heavy enough that moving it required a deliberate effort, decorated along its arm and base, with gilded scrollwork that had faded in places but hadn't disappeared. The cabinet it sat in was made of dark walnut, solid and square, with 2 drawers on either side, and a hinged leaf that could be folded out to extend the work surface. The cabinet's finish was worn at the edges, scuffed along the front where Ruth's knees had rested for decades, darkened with age and use, and the kind of gentle handling that leaves its own kind of mark. Dennis took one look at it and said, "That thing's worthless. Nobody wants old sewing machines. You'll have to pay someone to haul it." Trish agreed. She said she had seen one at an estate sale the year before, similar vintage, and it hadn't sold for more than $40 even after they lowered the price twice. She said it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for a moment to be the expert. Marcus was quieter about it, but no less certain. He said it was a nice piece of furniture, but that nice didn't pay bills, and Clara should be realistic about what the house would cost to maintain versus what it would bring if she sold it furnished and moved on. Clara listened to all of it. She wrote none of it down because she did not need to. She had heard the same argument in slightly different forms for 2 weeks, and she understood by now what it really meant. It meant that the people saying it needed her to believe the house, and everything in it, was worth less than it was, so that selling it and dividing the proceeds would feel like the reasonable, practical, even generous thing to do. She did not sell. She did not divide. She stayed. The children slept in the back bedroom, the one with the soft spot in the roof she had patched temporarily with a tarp weighted down with shingles she found in the shed. She slept in Ruth's room, in Ruth's bed, in sheets that still smelled faintly of the cedar sachets Ruth had tucked into every drawer and cabinet in the house. She lay in the dark those first nights and talked to Ruth in the way you talk to people who are no longer there, quietly and without expecting an answer, but needing to say the words regardless. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, "but I'm here." She began her inventory of the house on the 3rd day, working room by room with a notebook and a pen, writing down every item, its condition, and what she thought it might be worth. She had no particular expertise in antiques or estate sales, but she had the internet and a careful eye, and she moved through the house slowly, not in a hurry, because she had already decided that hurrying was the one thing she could not afford to do. Most of what she found was ordinary in the way of a life lived without extravagance, furniture that was good quality but not remarkable, kitchenware that was old and complete and useful. The fabric collection alone was genuinely impressive, bolts and cuts and remnants of material that she recognized from her own childhood visits, pieces Ruth had held on to because she had a use for them eventually, or because she simply couldn't let go of something beautiful. Clara found a local seamstress collective that was willing to buy the better part of the fabric at a price that surprised her pleasantly, and she set that money aside immediately in an account she labeled Roof Fund. The thimble collection turned out to be more interesting than it looked. She photographed each piece and posted them to a collectors forum she found after 2 hours of searching, and within a day she had responses from 3 people who identified several pieces as unusually old and well-preserved. A silver thimble with an engraved border turned out to date from the early 1900s and was worth more than $300 to the right buyer. Clara found the right buyer in less than a week. She felt something shift inside her when she held that check, not because of the amount, which was modest, but because of what it meant. Ruth had kept these things. Ruth had kept them carefully, deliberately, in a way that suggested she understood their value, even if she never said so. She began to pay closer attention. It was Maisie who first asked about the sewing machine in the way children ask about things, directly and without embarrassment, which is to say, She simply walked up to it one afternoon and said, "Mom, what's this thing do?" Clara showed her. She threaded the machine, which took her 2 attempts and the help of a YouTube video, and she ran a strip of scrap fabric through it to demonstrate the stitch. Maisie watched with the concentrated attention she gave to everything that interested her, which was considerable, and then asked if she could try. They spent an hour at the machine together that afternoon, Maisie's small hands guiding fabric in slightly crooked lines, while Clara adjusted the tension and kept the speed manageable. And it was the first afternoon in 2 weeks that Clara had stopped thinking about the roof and the bills and her cousin Dennis. When Maisie finally climbed down from the chair and went to find her brother, Clara sat alone at the machine and ran her fingers along its body. The cast iron was cool and solid under her touch, the kind of material that absorbed nothing and reflected everything, the same temperature in every season. The lacquer had hairline cracks in the finish near the needle plate, not damage, but age, the kind of aging that was its own form of authentication. She traced the gilded scrollwork, which up close was more intricate than it appeared from a distance, the lines looping and crossing in a pattern that reminded her of something she couldn't name. She opened the 2 cabinet drawers. The left one held bobbins, to a collection of machine feet in a small tin, an oil can dried to near empty, and several pages of the original instruction manual folded into thirds. The right drawer held spools of thread in colors Ruth had favored, deep blues, warm burgundies, a gray that was almost silver, and at the back, wrapped in a piece of white cotton batting, a small envelope with Clara's name written on the front in Ruth's handwriting. She sat very still for a moment before picking it up. The envelope was sealed. The paper was not new. She could tell by the texture of it and by the faint yellowing at the edges that it had been there for some time, not years, maybe, but long enough that it had settled into the drawer as if it belonged there. Her name on the front was written in the precise, upright script she had known since childhood, the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship from nuns and never unlearned it. She opened it carefully, sliding a finger under the flap without tearing the paper. Inside was a single note card. Ruth stationery, ivory with a small blue border, the kind she had kept in a box on the kitchen desk for as long as Clara could remember. The message was short. Ruth had never been a woman of many words when a few would do. "Clara," it read, "you always looked twice when everyone else looked once. Keep looking. I kept my most important work close to the machine. It was the work that made everything else possible. Don't let anyone rush you. Love, Ruth." Clara read it 3 times. Then she folded it back into the envelope and held it in both hands and looked at the sewing machine. "Keep looking." She looked. She started with what was visible. She ran her hands along the outside of the cabinet, testing each surface for loose panels or hidden compartments, the kind of thing you read about in stories, but never expected to find in real life. The cabinet felt entirely solid under her hands, the joints tight and unworn, the finish continuous without seams or gaps she hadn't already accounted for. She pulled the drawers out all the way and checked behind them, finding only the darkness of empty cabinet interior and the faint smell of cedar and machine oil that had been Ruth's particular scent. The hinged leaf on the right side folded out and latched back without resistance. She unlatched it, folded it fully out, and ran her hand underneath it. Nothing. She looked at the machine itself, the way it sat in its cabinet, the way it was mounted to the platform. She had assumed, as anyone would, that the machine simply rested in the cabinet, the way machines rest in cabinets. It occurred to her now, looking more carefully, that the cabinet and the machine were a unified piece, not separable, not in any way she could immediately see. She stood up and walked around to the back. The back of the cabinet was paneled, a single flat piece of walnut that covered the rear of the unit from the top of the work surface to the floor. She ran her hand along its surface and stopped. The lower section felt different, not dramatically different, not loose, not hollow-sounding when she tapped it, but subtly different, in the way that two pieces of wood from the same tree can be cut and finished and stained to match and still carry a slightly different density under the fingers of someone paying close enough attention. The lower panel had a texture that was just barely not the same as the upper panel, and when she crouched down and looked at it directly, the grain ran in a slightly different direction. The same species of wood, almost certainly. The same stain, unmistakably. But not the same board. At some point, someone had replaced this panel, or added it, or built behind it. She got down on her knees on the floor of the back room and looked at the base of the cabinet. The bottom edge of the cabinet sat on 4 small wooden feet, and the space between the base panel and the floor was no more than 2 inches. She pressed on the lower panel with her palm and felt so faintly she almost dismissed it. A give, not a swing, not a pop. Just the barely perceptible compression of something that was meant to look fixed, but was not entirely fixed. She pressed harder. Nothing moved. She sat back on her heels and stared at the panel. Then she stood up and went to Ruth's toolbox, which she had found in the kitchen pantry behind a bag of dog food that belonged to a dog Ruth no longer had, and she came back with a flathead screwdriver and a flashlight. She crouched again and pressed the screwdriver lightly into the seam where the lower panel met the base of the cabinet frame. She wasn't forcing anything. She was testing. The way you test a floorboard you suspect is loose, gently, carefully, listening for the sound of something releasing. She moved the blade along the seam from left to right, applying just enough pressure to feel for a difference, and about 2/3 of the way across she found it. A slight depression, a catch. She pressed the tip of the screwdriver into it and felt a click so small it was almost inaudible. Felt more in her fingers than heard by her ears. The lower panel moved. Not much. A 1/4 inch, maybe. But it moved, and when it moved, the entire panel shifted fractionally to the right, and she could see, in the gap that appeared at the left edge, not the back of the cabinet interior, but darkness. A sealed darkness that the light did not reach. She sat on the floor of her aunt's back room with the screwdriver in her hand, and she felt her breathing change. She pressed the panel fully to the right with both palms, and it slid cleanly, on a track she now understood had been built into the frame for exactly this purpose, revealing a compartment that ran the full width of the cabinet's base and was approximately 10 inches deep and 8 inches tall. The compartment was lined with the same cotton batting as the inside of the drawer where she had found the envelope. It had been lined carefully, smoothly. The batting fitted and pressed into the corners without gaps or bunching, the way Ruth fitted everything she worked on, with attention and precision, and the quiet pride of someone who did not do things part way. The compartment was not empty. Clara shone the flashlight into it and held very still. The first thing she saw was color. The dense, warm red-brown of leather. Several leather pouches, the kind with a drawstring top, small enough to hold in one hand. They were packed tightly into the lined space. Not stacked, but arranged side by side in a single layer, with a second layer visible beneath, like bottles in a wine rack, tilted slightly toward the front of the compartment. She reached in and lifted one of the pouches. It was heavier than its size suggested. Significantly heavier. She turned it over in her hands and felt through the leather, the hard, irregular shapes of what was inside. Small, solid objects, packed closely, some touching, shifting fractionally against each other as the pouch moved. The leather was soft and supple, well cared for, the drawstring tied in a bow that had been drawn tight and then knotted against coming loose. She did not open it yet. She put it down on the floor beside her and reached in for the next one. There were 11 pouches in the upper layer. She counted them as she removed them. on setting each one on the floor with the care she gave to things she did not fully understand. They were not all the same size. Some were no larger than her fist, others slightly longer, slightly flatter, as if they had been made for specific contents. All of them were made from the same tobacco brown leather, all tied with the same kind of waxed cotton drawstring. They had no markings on the outside, no labels, no dates, no initials. But as she lifted the last of the upper layer out of the compartment and shone the flashlight inside again, she saw that the second layer was different. Below the pouches, wrapped in a single piece of heavy linen and tied with ribbon, was something flat and rectangular. A document, or several documents. She could see the edge of the paper at the corner of the linen wrap, thick and cream-colored, the kind of paper that institutions used for important things. She left it where it was for now. She turned her attention back to the leather pouches arranged on the floor around her, 11 of them, silent and heavy, waiting with the patience of things that had been waiting for years already and had no urgency about waiting a few minutes more. She picked up the smallest one again, loosened the knot, opened the drawstring. She tilted the pouch and let the contents slide into her palm. Diamonds, not one or two. A cascade of them, small and brilliant, filling the cup of her hand with the kind of cold, concentrated light that does not look entirely real when you are not expecting it. They caught the beam of the flashlight and fractured it into fragments that scattered across the ceiling and the walls of the back room, brief and brilliant and gone as soon as she moved her hand. She stared at them. She counted without meaning to. 14 of them in her palm, maybe 15, some no larger than a match head, others the size of a small pea. They were not loose stones rattled up from the bottom of a jewelry box. They were cut, faceted, each one shaped with deliberate intention, each one a small, precise object that someone had made, and Ruth had kept. Clara lowered her hand slowly and let the stones slide back into the pouch. She pulled the drawstring tight and knotted it again, with hands that were not entirely steady. She sat on the floor of the back room for a long moment. The afternoon light had shifted while she had been kneeling, moving west across the window, and the room had taken on the amber quality of late day. The kind of light that makes everything look both more beautiful and more serious than it did an hour before. She thought about Ruth. She thought about the 40 years of seamstress work, the factory job and the home studio, the wedding dresses and the choir robes and the altar cloths for 3 different churches. She thought about the woman who had lived alone in this house for 3 decades, without complaint, who had worn clothes that were decades out of fashion but perfectly maintained, who had driven a car until it needed to be replaced rather than until she wanted a new one, who had kept her house and kept her accounts and kept her life with the meticulous, unfussy discipline of someone who had always understood that discipline was its own form of freedom. She thought about what that life looked like from the outside, what Dennis had seen when he walked into this house, what Trish had seen, what the people who had called her for 2 weeks to tell her that the house was a burden and the sewing machine was worthless had seen when they looked at Ruth Calloway. She reached back into the compartment and began removing the second layer of pouches. There were 14 of them, similar in size to the first layer, some slightly larger. She set them beside the first 11 in a row on the floor. 25 leather pouches in total, arranged on the linoleum of a room that still smelled of cedar and machine oil, in a house that nobody in her family had thought was worth keeping. The linen-wrapped document remained in the compartment. She left it there while she looked at the pouches arranged in front of her. Outside, she could hear Maisie and Jonah in the backyard, their voices carrying in the particular way of children who are not fighting but are competing, the sound of a ball hitting the wooden fence, Jonah counting something loudly, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that does not know It is the one that changes everything, the kind that comes and goes and only reveals its weight in retrospect. Clara sat on the floor between what she had found and the rest of her life, and she held very still. She thought about the note. I kept my most important work close to the machine. It was the work that made everything else possible. She had assumed that meant the sewing. She had assumed Ruth was speaking about fabric and thread, and the hours spent bent over this machine producing the careful and skilled labor of a lifetime's vocation. But Ruth had been a precise woman, with a precise command of language, and the word work had meant something specific to her. Most important work. Not most important project. Not most beloved piece. Work, the kind of word that implies effort and intention and reward. The kind of word that implies something made, something earned, something that took years to accumulate. Clara looked at the 25 pouches on the floor. She opened the next one, colored stones this time. Deep and vivid in the flashlight beam, a saturation of color that she recognized from photographs and descriptions, but had never seen up close in this way. She picked one up and held it to the light. The red was so dense it seemed to absorb the beam before releasing it slowly, like something burning from the inside out. She did not know enough to name the specific variety, but she knew enough to understand that no stone with that color and that clarity came from a craft supply store or a costume jewelry counter. She opened a third pouch. More diamonds, larger than the first. A fourth. More colored stones, this time a deep saturated blue. A fifth, and in it, something she had not anticipated. Not loose stones, but a folded cloth, and inside the cloth, nestled in the soft interior, a collection of pearls strung on a thread so fine she could barely see it. Not a necklace, but unset pearls, individual and graduated, arranged by size from smallest to largest. The largest no bigger than a marble, but with the kind of luster that distinguished the genuinely rare from the merely pretty. She sat back and looked at what was in front of her and understood, in the specific and humbling way you understand things that dismantle your assumptions, that she had not found a modest collection. She had not found a bit of grandmother's jewelry tucked away for sentiment. She had found something systematically accumulated over years by a woman who had kept her own counsel about it for as long as she had kept everything else she considered important, which was to say forever, which was to say until she was gone and could no longer keep it herself. The room was very quiet. Clara could still hear her children outside. She could hear the furnace making its old man sound somewhere in the walls. She picked up the linen-wrapped document from the back of the compartment and held it in her lap without opening it. Whatever was in those pouches, whatever Ruth had spent a lifetime collecting and protecting and keeping close to the machine she had sat beside for 40 years, the document would tell her something she needed to know. Maybe what it was. Maybe what it was worth. Maybe why Ruth had kept it hidden. She untied the ribbon. She folded back the linen. Inside were 4 sheets of paper, thick and formal, each one carrying a letterhead she did not immediately recognize, each one dated and signed in the bottom right corner, with signatures that were not Ruth's, but were clearly professional. The compact, authoritative signatures of experts. The top sheet was a valuation certificate. Her eyes went directly to the number. She read it once. She read it again. She set the paper down on the floor and sat very still for a long time, on looking at the sewing machine and listening to the sound of her children playing in the yard of the house that everyone had told her she should sell. Outside, the light continued to move. The shadows in the back room lengthened, and the amber of late afternoon deepened toward evening. Maisie called for Jonah. Jonah called back. The furnace ticked. Clara picked up the paper and read it a third time. $221 million. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the machine. and thought about Ruth, who had lived alone and quietly and without complaint for 30 years, who had driven the same car until it died, who had worn the same clothes until they wore out, who had kept her most important work close to the machine, who had left everything to Clara because Clara was the one who came, who had looked at her niece, and struggling and careful and trying very hard, and decided that this was the person who would look twice when everyone else looked once. Clara sat in the back room of the house on Calloway Street until the room was nearly dark, and then she got up and went to the window and looked out at her children in the yard, and she felt something in her chest that she could not name precisely, something between grief and gratitude, between the weight of what she had lost and the impossible brightness of what she had just found. She had come here to honor what Ruth left her. She had not known, until now, the full scale of what that was. She went to the window and opened it and called her children inside for dinner. Her voice was steady. Her hands, when she reached out to unlatch the window frame, were not shaking anymore. They were ready. She did not tell anyone that night. She fed her children pasta with butter and garlic because it was what she could make in 20 minutes, and it was what they asked for, and she needed the simplicity of a meal that required no decisions. She listened to Maisie talk about a book she was reading, something about a girl who discovered a door behind a wallpapered wall and found an entire world on the other side. She listened to Jonah argue gently that the book was too young for him, and that he had read it in 3rd grade, and that it was still a good story, even if he was past it. She nodded at the right moments, and asked the right questions, and sat at the table in the kitchen of her aunt's house, and felt the knowledge of what was in the back room pressing against the inside of her chest like a second heartbeat. So after the children were asleep, she went back to the back room and sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the sewing machine cabinet, and she opened the valuation certificate again and read it, start to finish, slowly this time, not just the number, but everything around the number. The letterhead read, Calloway and Marsh Gemological Services, an address in New York City. The date on the document was 4 years earlier. The appraiser's name was printed below the signature, a Dr. Evelyn Marsh, GIA certified, with a credential listing that ran 5 lines long. The document described the collection in clinical, precise language that Clara had to read twice to fully parse. Loose diamonds, brilliant cut, ranging from 0.4 to 3.2 carats. Total weight 87.4 carats, across 311 individual stones. Natural colored gemstones, including rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, totaling 112 certified stones across varying cuts and clarities, with individual stones reaching investment-grade classification. Natural saltwater pearls, 43 individual specimens, unstrung, ranging from 6.1 to 12.4 millimeters, with luster grading of excellent to exceptional. Total assessed value of collection at current market rates, $221,430,000. This valuation represents fair market assessment and does not constitute sale price or insurance replacement value. Clara read the last sentence 3 times. Fair market assessment. Not the price someone desperate would accept. Not the number someone pressured and alone and $43 in cash would settle for. The number the collection was actually worth, assessed 4 years ago, which meant in the current market it was potentially worth more. She set the document down and reached for the other 3 sheets. The second was a provenance document, also on Calloway and Marsh letterhead, which traced the origins of the major stones in the collection. Several of the diamonds had GIA certificates, the Gemological Institute of America's individual stone grading reports, which constituted the closest thing to a stone's identity papers. The rubies were noted as likely Burmese origin, the sapphires as Kashmir and Ceylon, the distinctions that in gemology meant the difference between fine stones and extraordinary ones. The provenance document noted that the collection showed evidence of having been assembled over an extended period, likely 3 to 4 decades, with stones of varying eras and acquisition patterns. It was not the collection of a person who had bought a suite of jewelry at auction and stored it. It was the collection of a person who had bought individual stones, carefully, over a very long time, one at a time or in small lots, with knowledge and patience and a very specific eye for quality. The third sheet was a storage and insurance recommendation, also signed by Dr. Marsh, advising that the collection be placed in a climate-controlled, certified, secure facility and insured at replacement value immediately. It noted that the leather pouches, while appropriate for short-term storage, were not suitable for long-term preservation of investment-grade gemstones. The sheet was dated the same day as the valuation certificate, so attached to it with a paperclip that had left a faint rust mark on the corner was a business card for a private vault facility in Greensboro, 30 minutes from the house on Calloway Street. On the back of the card, in Ruth's handwriting, a single line, "Not yet." Clara stared at those 2 words for a long time. Not yet. The handwriting was the same precise, upright script as the note card in the drawer. Ruth had written it with the same calm deliberation she brought to everything she wrote, and it meant exactly what it said. She had read the storage recommendation. She had kept the vault facility's card. She had thought about it. And she had decided, for reasons she had not chosen to explain, that the time was not yet right to move the collection. The fourth sheet was a personal letter, not from the gemologist, but from Ruth herself, handwritten on the same ivory stationery as the note card Clara had found in the drawer. It was dated 3 years ago. "Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have already found the machine's secret, which means you looked the way I always knew you would. I want to explain some things, not because you need permission to have them, but because you deserve to understand where they came from and what they cost." Clara moved closer to the lamp in the corner and held the paper in both hands. "I started buying stones in 1979. The first one was a small diamond, 3/4 of a carat, from a jeweler in Greensboro who was settling his estate and needed cash quickly. I paid $400 for it, which was more than I could afford at the time, and which I have never once regretted. I had been reading about diamonds for 2 years by then. I read everything I could find, gemology textbooks from the library, industry journals I subscribed to with money I saved from skipping lunches, correspondence with a retired appraiser in Asheville who was kind enough to answer the letters of a woman he had never met who wanted to learn. I learned what made a stone valuable, and I learned the difference between what a stone was worth and what someone willing to take advantage of a seller's ignorance would pay for it. I decided I would never be that seller. Every year I put aside what I could. Some years it was not much. Some years it was more than I expected. I bought stones the way some women buy land, the way your grandfather bought land, patiently, without hurry, when the price was right and the quality was what I required. I kept them in the cabinet because the cabinet was mine and because I trusted it the way I trusted my own hands. I never told anyone because I had learned early that the things most worth protecting are the things most worth keeping quiet. The collection is yours entirely. The valuation certificate, the GIA reports for the certified stones, and the letter of provenance are legal documentation of the collection's legitimacy. You will need a good attorney and a good gemologist. Both should be people you find yourself, not people someone else recommends to you. Trust your own judgment. You have always had better judgment than you gave yourself credit for. One more thing. The pearls are the ones I am most proud of. The large center stone of the pearl collection, the 12.4 millimeter specimen, is exceptionally rare. Dr. Marsh told me it was one of the finest natural saltwater pearls she had examined in 20 years of practice. I bought it in 1994 from a private collector in Charleston for $11,000. At the time, $11,000 was an amount that frightened me considerably. I paid it because I understood what I was buying. I tell you this not to show off, but to remind you that the most frightening decisions are sometimes the most correct ones. I love you, Clara. Keep going. Ruth. Clara folded the letter along its original creases and held it in her lap, and she sat in the amber light of the lamp in the back room of the house on Calloway Street, and she let herself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had been managing for the 2 weeks since Ruth died, but the kind she had been keeping underneath the surface while she organized and inventoried and handled things. These were the kind that came from somewhere deeper, the kind that had no particular shape or reason and did not care about composure. She sat on the floor of the back room and she cried for Ruth, who had spent 40 years alone in this house, accumulating something extraordinary in patient silence, who had trusted her with it, who had written the letter 3 years ago because she understood she would not be here to say it in person. She cried for herself, for the $43 and the electric bill and the cereal for dinner and all the years of just barely and not quite and almost, but not yet. She cried for the version of herself who had stood in that grocery store parking lot not 3 weeks ago and believed, with the deep and tired certainty of someone who has been struggling for too long, that the ceiling she was living under was permanent. It wasn't permanent. It had never been permanent. It had only been waiting for the person who would look twice. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat up straight and looked at the sewing machine. In the lamplight, it was beautiful in a way she had never properly noticed before. The scroll work picking up the gold of the light, the lacquer casting a deep, still reflection. Ruth had sat at this machine for 4 decades, making beautiful things for other people, and all the while the cabinet it sat in had held the one beautiful thing she had made entirely for herself. A collection assembled stone by stone over a lifetime, so a fortune built from patience and knowledge, and the kind of disciplined vision that most people never develop, because most people are too busy being told what something is worth by someone else. Clara got up off the floor. She went to the kitchen and washed her face at the sink, and stood at the window, looking out at the dark yard, while the water ran cold over her wrists. She was thinking with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a long cry, the kind of thinking that is stripped of everything extraneous and arrives at only what is true and necessary. She was thinking about what came next. She needed 3 things: an attorney who worked exclusively for her, a gemologist who could verify the collection independently, and time. Not much time, but enough. Enough to do this correctly, without pressure, without the family bearing down on her before she understood what she was holding. She dried her hands and went to bed. The attorney took 3 days to find. She was not looking for someone in the family's network, not someone who had handled Ruth's estate, not someone whose name had been offered to her by anyone who might have an interest in what she discovered. She searched alone, reading reviews and credentials, calling offices, asking specific questions about experience with estates, gemological assets, and probate disputes. She found a woman named Patricia Lord in Durham, 40 minutes away, who had 22 years of experience in estate law, and whose reviews mentioned specifically her ability to manage complex asset situations with discretion. Clara called the office on a Tuesday morning from the back room of the house, with the door closed and her voice low. She told Patricia Lord that she had inherited property and discovered within it a collection of gemstones with a prior professional valuation in the range of $200 million, that the estate had been left to her solely and legally, and that she needed counsel before she took any further steps. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Patricia Lord said, "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" Clara could. She brought the valuation certificate, the provenance document, the letter from Ruth, and a selection of photographs she had taken of the pouches and their contents. Careful, well-lit photographs that showed the quality of the stones, clearly without requiring her to bring them out of the house before she had proper security in place. She also brought the original will, notarized and filed, leaving the house and its entire contents to Clara Jean Holt, without exception, without division, without condition. Patricia Lord examined each document without speaking, reading carefully and completely the way people do when the information matters. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at Clara with the specific expression of a professional who has seen many things and is calibrating how much of what she is about to say to reveal. "The will is airtight," she said. "The estate was filed correctly, and there is no legal ground for contest based on what you have here. The gemological valuation is professionally credentialed and legally admissible as documentation of asset value. You have what you need." "What do I do first?" Clara asked. "You verify the collection independently," Patricia said. "You do not use the same firm that conducted the prior valuation. You use someone with equally strong credentials and no prior connection to this estate. I have 2 names. You choose between them based on your own research, not my recommendation, because you need to trust your own process from here." That was exactly what Ruth's letter had said. Clara felt something settle inside her, the recognition of a woman who had thought this through. She took both names. She went home. She researched. She chose a gemologist named Dr. Thomas Price, based in Charlotte, so affiliated with the American Society of Jewelry Historians and holding dual certifications from the GIA and the International Gemological Institute. She called his office the following morning and explained, with deliberate brevity, that she had inherited a private gemstone collection and needed an independent full assessment. She said the collection had been previously valued at approximately $200 million and asked if he was available within the next 2 weeks. There was silence on his end, too. Then, "I can make myself available within the week." She arranged for a private security transport service, recommended by Patricia Lord, to move the collection from the house on Calloway Street to Dr. Price's assessment facility in Charlotte. The transport team arrived on a Thursday morning in an unmarked vehicle, and 2 men in plain clothes who were professional and entirely unhurried, and who packed the pouches into a certified transport case with the careful efficiency of people who handled valuable things routinely. They gave her a chain of custody document to sign. They were gone in 40 minutes. The cabinet in the back room looked emptier after they left, the lower compartment standing open, the linen wrap folded neatly on the work surface. Clara closed the compartment panel, feeling the faint click of its release catch, and stood in the room for a moment before she closed the door behind her. 2 days later, she drove to Charlotte alone. Maisie and Jonah stayed with a neighbor she trusted. She left early in the morning while the sky was still pale and arrived at Dr. Price's facility, on a clean and quiet professional space in a building that could have been a law office or an accounting firm, if not for the specialized lighting and the large magnification equipment visible through the glass partition of the assessment room. Dr. Price was a lean man in his 60s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of precise, unhurried manner she was beginning to associate with people who spent their lives examining things closely. He shook her hand and walked her through the process before he began. He would assess each stone individually, cross-reference the GIA reports for the certified diamonds, conduct spectrographic testing on the colored stones to verify origin indicators, and provide a written, independent assessment. The process would take most of the day. He invited her to wait in the reception area, though he did not suggest she leave and come back. He understood, she thought, that she was not going anywhere. She sat in the reception area for 6 hours and read nothing, looked at her phone infrequently, and mostly watched the light move across the floor. She thought about Ruth at 29 years old in 1979, walking into a jeweler's shop in Greensboro with $400 she couldn't really afford, and buying a diamond because she had spent 2 years learning what she was looking at. She thought about what it took to sustain that kind of quiet determination across 40 years, to keep adding to something slowly and carefully, and never tell anyone, and never waver. She thought about the factory job and the home studio, and the decades of choir robes and wedding dresses, but all of it poured into work that paid modestly and honestly, and funded, one stone at a time, a parallel life that no one could see. At 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Price came out of the assessment room and sat across from her. He placed a preliminary report on the table between them. He folded his hands on top of it and looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Ms. Holt, I have been assessing gemological collections professionally for 31 years. What you have inherited is, by any standard I am qualified to apply, an extraordinary collection. The prior valuation from Calloway and Marsh is sound. My independent assessment will refine some of the numbers, but will not reduce the overall figure significantly. In fact, in several categories, particularly the natural-colored stones and the pearl specimens, so current market conditions mean the valuation will be higher than the prior assessment." "How much higher?" Clara said. He looked at his report. "My preliminary estimate, pending completion of the spectrographic results, places the collection at between $238 and $252 million at current fair market rates." Clara nodded. She kept her face still. She had practiced this in her mind, on the drive to Charlotte, the moment when the number was confirmed. She had practiced keeping still. She thanked Dr. Price. She asked when the written report would be complete. He said 10 days. She shook his hand and walked to her car in the parking lot and sat behind the wheel for 5 minutes before she started the engine. Through the windshield, the Charlotte skyline was pale against the late afternoon and ordinary, and entirely unchanged by what had just happened in a room she had just walked out of. She started the car and drove home. It was on the drive home that her phone began. Not from Patricia Lord, not from Dr. Price, from Dennis. She did not answer the first call. She did not answer the second. The third came 15 minutes later, with a text immediately following it that read, "We need to talk about the house. I know you've been doing something in there. People have been asking questions." She put the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving. She did not know who had been talking. She had been careful. She had told no one except Patricia Lord and Dr. Price, both of whom were legally bound to confidentiality. But small towns were not sealed environments. The security transport vehicle arriving on a Thursday morning. The fact that she had been spending weeks in the house instead of selling it. The occasional question she had asked at the county records office about the property's formal assessed value. Any of these things, observed by the wrong person and communicated to someone looking for information, could have triggered exactly the kind of attention she had not wanted. Dennis called again before she reached Greensboro. This time she answered. He was using his reasonable voice, the one he employed when he had decided that anger was less effective than appearing to be the rational party. "Clara," he said, "I understand you're going through a lot. We all are. Ruth's death has been hard on everyone. But there are family obligations here. And there are people who feel left out of something. And I think we all need to sit down together and talk about what's fair." "What specifically?" she said. "What's in the house?" he said. "Someone said you had people coming in and out. Someone said there was a transport vehicle." "Someone," Clara said. Her voice was even. "People talk," he said. "This is a small place. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want to make sure everything is being handled in a way that's transparent and fair to the whole family." Ruth handled transparency and fairness in the will, Clara said. It was transparent and fair to whoever Ruth decided it was fair to. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "there may be things in that house that belong to the family. Ruth may not have known what she had. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly about the implications." And Clara thought about the letter, the 40-year plan, the provenance documents, the GIA certificates, the storage recommendation with the note that said "not yet written," with the controlled precision of a woman who thought more clearly about the implications of things than most people Clara had ever met. Ruth knew exactly what she had, she said, and she knew exactly who she left it to. She ended the call. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. Not of what she had found or what it was worth. She had that elsewhere, documented and secured. She wrote a list of every person who had called or texted or shown up in the 2 weeks since the will was read to tell her that the house was a burden, or the sewing machine was worthless, or the right thing to do was to divide and sell. She wrote the list not to feel angry, though she did feel angry, a clean and precise anger that did not cloud her thinking but sharpened it. She wrote it because she wanted to remember the shape of the world as it had been when she was the woman with $43 in the parking lot, so that she could remember it accurately later when the world changed its tone. She was under no illusion that the world would not change its tone. She had watched enough of life to understand that the people who called something worthless became the people who claimed they had always suspected it was valuable, and the people who had advised you to walk away became the people who reminded you that they had always been on your side. The call from Marcus came 2 days later. He had a different approach than Dennis, calmer and more tactical. Now, he said he had done some research, that old sewing machines could be worth quite a bit to the right collector, that he knew someone who dealt in antiques and vintage furniture, and that he just wanted to make sure she was getting proper advice and wasn't being taken advantage of by anyone. He said it the way people say things, when they want to sound like they are protecting you while actually extracting information from you. Clara told him she had proper counsel and thanked him for his concern. He asked directly whether the machine was being appraised. She said her attorney was handling all assessments related to the estate. He asked who her attorney was. She said she would have her attorney's office reach out to him if there was anything family members needed to be formally informed of. He did not call back that day. The day Dr. Price's written report arrived by secure courier was the same day the furnace finally gave up entirely. It chose a morning when the temperature had dropped to 31 degrees, and both children were home from school for a teacher workday, and it made its last sound at 6:15 in the morning, a long, exhausted exhalation that Clara heard from Ruth's bedroom, and that she recognized immediately as a thing that was not coming back. She put extra blankets on the children, called a furnace repair company that Patricia Lord had recommended for its discretion in handling estates under legal review, and while she waited for the technician, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the report. Dr. Price's final assessment placed the collection at $244,612,000. His written notes ran 12 pages and detailed each category of the collection with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the document would eventually matter in ways beyond a single estate. The diamond assessment confirmed all 311 stones, with 7 of the largest specimens reevaluated upward from the prior appraisal due to revised market conditions for exceptional cut quality. The colored stone assessment noted 3 rubies of Burmese origin as meeting the threshold for investment-grade classification, a designation that placed them in the category of stones whose value was measured not against jewelry markets, but against the rarer, higher-tier market of institutional collectors and auction houses. The Pearl assessment described the 12.4 millimeter specimen in language that Clara read twice. It is among the finest examples of natural saltwater pearl I have examined in my professional career. Its provenance, luster, and surface quality place it firmly in the category of exceptional specimens that would command significant attention at major auction. Estimated individual value of this specimen alone, based on recent comparable sales data, between $1.2 and $1.8 million. $11,000 in 1994. Between $1.2 and $1.8 million today. Ruth had paid $11,000 for something that was now worth 150 times what she had paid for it. Not because she had been lucky, because she had known what she was buying. Clara set the report down and looked at the ceiling. The furnace technician arrived 20 minutes later and confirmed what she already knew. The unit was beyond repair and would need to be replaced. The cost would be approximately $4,000 for a new installation. $4,000. She would have needed to borrow it 3 weeks ago. She did not need to borrow it now, but she had not yet accessed anything. The collection was in a secure facility. The estate was still in the early stages of legal formalization. Nothing was liquid yet. Nothing was transferable. And Patricia Lord had been clear that the process of formally establishing the asset's ownership and creating a legal pathway for its management and eventual sale or preservation would take months, not days. The right way to handle something of this magnitude required patience. It required the same patience Ruth had exercised for 40 years. Clara authorized the furnace replacement from the modest savings she had brought with her from home. She made the decision without hesitation and without regret, because she understood something now that she had not understood fully before she found the note in the drawer and the compartment behind the panel and the leather pouches lined up in the lamplight. She understood that the ceiling she had been living under for years had never been a ceiling at all. It had been a temporary condition, a waiting room, a long, cold parking lot between one life and another. She was not in the parking lot anymore. She went to the back room while the technician worked in the furnace room down the hall, and she stood at the sewing machine, and she put both hands on its iron body the way she had watched Ruth put both hands on it 1,000 times as a girl, and settling in at the start of a long morning's work, centering herself in the space and the task and the specific kind of patience that producing something beautiful required. The room was cold still, the new furnace not yet running, the breath visible in the air. But Clara did not feel cold. She felt something she had not felt in long enough that she had almost forgotten it had a name. She felt steady. She thought about the weeks ahead. The family would press harder as the word spread. Dennis would escalate, find an attorney of his own, produce arguments about Ruth's mental clarity or the proper distribution of family assets. Trish would surface with claims Clara couldn't predict. Marcus would try the measured, reasonable approach until it stopped working, and then switch to something else. They would use every tool available to people who believe that persistence equals entitlement, and they would not stop because they were not the kind of people who stopped when they were told no. But they were also not the kind of people who planned. They were reactive, opportunistic, moved by the immediate pressure of believing they were owed something. Ruth had planned. Ruth had planned for 40 years, and she had anticipated every one of these pressures, and she had placed her documents and her collection and her letter and her note in the cabinet in the back room, and she had trusted the one person she knew would not be hurried, would not be pressured, would not decide that what she had found was worth less than it was just because someone else said so. Clara straightened up from the machine. She picked up Dr. Aunt Price's report from the work table and carried it to the kitchen, where she had a folder of documents organized and ready for her next meeting with Patricia Lord. She placed the report at the front of the folder and wrote the date on the tab in her own handwriting. Outside, the November trees stood bare and still against a white sky. The yard was quiet, the children not yet awake. The house on Calloway Street sat in the early morning, the way it had sat for 30 years, while Ruth worked in the back room with the door open and the machine running and the cabinet beside her holding its secret in patient, unwavering silence. The house was hers. The collection was hers. The letter was hers. Every stone and every pearl and every certified document that described their extraordinary value was hers. And there was not a single clause in a single legal instrument that said otherwise. She put the kettle on the stove. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her notebook to a clean page, and at the top she wrote, in her own neat hand, a single heading. What comes next? And she began to write. She wrote carefully and in detail, the way Ruth had kept her ledgers and her notes and her letters, because she understood now that precision was its own form of power, that a woman who documented what she knew and kept it organized and acted from a position of knowledge rather than fear was a woman that no one could easily move. She wrote down the legal steps Patricia had outlined, the formal asset registration, the estate tax assessment, the insurance underwriting process, to the establishment of a private trust to house and manage the collection going forward. She wrote down the names she needed to contact, not contact today, but contact in the right order, because order mattered. She wrote down a list of questions she still had, not anxious questions, but operational ones, the questions of someone who was managing something rather than being overwhelmed by it. She was still writing when Maisie came into the kitchen in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, asking if there was cereal. "There's cereal," Clara said, "and I'm going to go to the grocery store today." Maisie opened the cabinet and pulled down a box and found the bowls, and did not notice anything different in the kitchen or in her mother. Children often don't notice the things that have already happened inside a person. They notice only the surface of the morning. And on the surface, the morning was ordinary. The kitchen warm now, the kettle steaming, the light coming through the window over the sink in the pale and directionless way of November light. But Clara sat at the table with her notebook and her pen and her folder of documents, and she felt the full weight of what she was carrying, and she did not buckle under it. She felt instead the particular quality of readiness that comes to a person who has been prepared for something without knowing they were being prepared. The way Ruth had prepared her, not with instructions or warnings or speeches, but by being the kind of woman she was, steady and precise and patient and unwilling to let anyone else decide what something was worth. Jonah came in next, immediately interested in what was for breakfast, on negotiating for something warm. Clara got up and made eggs. She stood at the stove and cracked 4 eggs into the pan and thought about the call she would make that afternoon, not to Dennis or Marcus or anyone in the family orbit. She would call Patricia Lord. She would confirm the receipt of the final appraisal report. She would discuss the next step in the asset registration process. She would ask about timeline, and she would ask about the specific legal protections available to her if family members initiated formal challenges, because they would, and because the best response to a challenge was not surprise, but preparation. She slid the eggs onto plates and called the children to the table, and they sat together in the kitchen in the house on Calloway Street, ordinary and unhurried, to a mother and her children having breakfast on a November morning. In the back room, the sewing machine stood on its cabinet in the late autumn light, the lower panel closed and latched, the empty compartment behind it, a space that no longer needed to hold anything because what it had held for years was now where it was supposed to be, out of the dark and into the hands of the person who had come to find it. The family was coming. Clara knew that with the same certainty she knew weather now. the particular heaviness in the air that preceded a front moving in. Dennis would not be satisfied with phone calls much longer. The distance between Charlotte and Greensboro was not a barrier to a man who felt he had something to gain, and she had now, by not returning his calls with any information, given him enough silence to fill with assumptions. She did not know what he had heard, or from whom. She did not know what shape the family's narrative had taken in the 3 weeks since the will was read. She only knew it would arrive on her doorstep before long, and it would not knock politely. She kept working. She kept organizing. She kept being the woman with the notebook and the pen and the folder in the correct order, because that was what Ruth had trusted her to be, and because she had already found the thing that everyone had told her was worthless. She already knew what she was holding. Dennis arrived on a Saturday. He did not call ahead, which told her everything she needed to know about his state of mind. A man who calls ahead is still negotiating. A man who simply appears at your door on a Saturday morning with his coat on and his jaw set has already decided that negotiation is over, and that what comes next is pressure, the kind that requires physical presence to properly apply. Clara saw his car from the kitchen window at 8:45 in the morning. She recognized the silver sedan, the way it parked too close to the porch steps, slightly crooked, the way a person parks when they are not thinking about parking, but about what they are going to say when they get out of the car. She set down her coffee. She checked that her phone was charged. She went to the front door and opened it before he could knock. He was not alone. Trish was in the passenger seat, just getting out. And behind the silver sedan, pulling in along the narrow strip of gravel drive, was Marcus's blue truck. They had come together. That was organized in a way she had not expected from people she had privately assessed as reactive. Someone had done the organizing. She suspected Dennis, who for all his bluntness had a functional understanding of the way that numbers looked different when more people were standing behind them. She stood in the doorway and waited. Dennis came up the porch steps first. He was wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed this, the one that was meant to look like reasonableness, but was structured underneath by something harder. He said, "Good morning." She said good morning back. He said he hoped she didn't mind the drop-in. They had all been trying to reach her, and they felt that, given the circumstances, a conversation in person was overdue. She told him she had been busy managing the estate, which was true. He said he understood that, and he asked if they could come in. She stepped back and let them in. She would not have the conversation on the porch. She would have it at the kitchen table, where she had her notebook and her folder, and the particular quality of calm that came from having done her preparation. They sat around the kitchen table, the way families sit in kitchens, when the thing on the table is not food, crowded together and not quite looking at each other. Trish had brought a coffee from a drive-thru, which she held with both hands as if for warmth or armor. Marcus sat with his elbows on the table, his fingers laced, his eyes moving around the room in a way she recognized as assessment, taking inventory. But Dennis sat directly across from her and folded his hands the way her attorney folded her hands, and Clara noted the mimicry without expression. She let the silence go for a moment before she spoke, because she had learned in the past weeks that silence was a tool and not an absence, and that the person who filled it first was usually the person who was less prepared. Dennis filled it. He said, "Clara, we are not here to make trouble. We are here because we are family, and because there are things happening with this estate that affect all of us, and we deserve to be part of the conversation." She said, "What specifically do you feel you deserve to be part of?" He said, "We've been hearing things. About assessments, about transport vehicles, about significant assets in this house that may not have been accounted for in the estate filing." She asked who he had been hearing things from. He said it didn't matter. She said it mattered to her because the estate was under legal management, and any information about its contents was confidential under the terms of the current proceedings, and she was curious how confidential information had become something he was hearing. Dennis shifted in his seat. He said, "Clara, I don't want to get into a legal argument. I want to talk about what's right. Ruth was our family. This house is our family's history. Whatever is in this house is part of all of our stories, not just yours." She looked at him steadily. She had been thinking about this conversation for 2 weeks. She had thought about it at the kitchen table at night and on the drive to Charlotte and in the waiting room of Dr. Price's facility while the light moved across the floor. And she had thought about what she would say and how she would say it, and whether she would say it with anger or with patience. And she had decided on patience, not because the anger wasn't real, but because patience was more accurate. Anger would make her say things that felt good in the moment and cost her later. Patience would let her say only what was true and necessary and irrefutable. She said, "Dennis, the will was read 3 weeks ago by a licensed attorney in the presence of all of us. It was clear, and it was legal, and it left this house and its entire contents to me, not to the family. Not divided, not subject to discussion, to me. That document exists not because Ruth was confused or old or didn't understand the implications. It exists because Ruth understood the implications better than anyone in this room, including me, and she made a decision based on 40 years of knowing who showed up and who didn't. I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not going to renegotiate it, and I would encourage all of you, as gently as I can, to speak to your own attorneys before you spend any more time or energy pursuing something that has no legal foundation." The kitchen was quiet. Trish looked at her coffee. Marcus unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table and looked at the surface of it. Dennis looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone recalculating. She could see him running through the remaining options, the arguments he had prepared that had not yet been deployed. He said, "And what exactly is in this house, Clara? Because you can say it's all yours. But if there are assets here worth significant money, assets that Ruth may have accumulated from family resources over the years, then the question of ownership is more complicated than one document." She said, Ruth's resources were Ruth's resources. She earned her income, she managed her finances, and she made her own decisions about her own property for 60 years. If you have specific evidence that any asset in this estate was funded by shared family resources, your attorney can submit that claim through the appropriate legal channels, and my attorney will respond to it. Until then, the estate is mine, and it is being managed accordingly. Dennis leaned forward. "Clara, what is in this house?" She looked at him across the table. She thought about Ruth at 29 years old with $400 and a diamond and 40 years ahead of her. She thought about the letter. The most frightening decisions are sometimes the most correct ones. She said, something Ruth built. Something she built alone over a very long time, with her own money and her own knowledge and her own judgment. Something she left to me because I was the one who came. And that is all I'm going to say about it today. She stood up. She thanked them for driving out. She told them that any further communication should go through Patricia Lord's office, whose contact information she would email to all of them before the end of the day. She walked to the front door, and she opened it. They left. Not quickly, not gracefully, with the particular stiffness of people who came to exert pressure and found nothing to press against. Dennis walked to his car without speaking. Trish said, quietly and without looking directly at Clara, "Son, I always liked Ruth." Clara said, "I know. I did too." Marcus was the last one down the porch steps. He paused at the bottom and turned back, and for a moment his face was different. Not the calculating one, just the one of a man who had grown up in the same family and was realizing that something had shifted beyond his reach. He said, "Do you actually know what you have?" Clara said, "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, and got into his truck. She closed the door and stood in the hallway and let out a breath she had been holding for 45 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen and called Patricia Lord. The legal challenges came, as she had anticipated. Dennis retained an attorney in Charlotte who filed a petition challenging the estate's distribution on the grounds of undue influence, arguing that Ruth, in her final years, who had been subject to manipulation by Clara, who had cultivated a relationship with the sole purpose of positioning herself to inherit. The petition cited Clara's regular Sunday phone calls, her holiday visits, and her presence at Ruth's medical appointments as evidence of a sustained campaign to influence the outcome of the will. The language was clinical and deliberate and entirely disconnected from the actual texture of those 11 years of Sunday calls, which had been about Ruth's week and Clara's children and the price of fabric and the book Ruth was reading and the weather in Greensboro. Not about inheritance, never once about inheritance, because neither of them had ever felt the need to discuss what was going to happen, because they both already knew what mattered and what didn't. Patricia Lord responded to the petition with the measured efficiency of someone who had seen this pattern many times and was neither surprised nor alarmed by it. She submitted Ruth's medical records, showing full cognitive capacity through her final year. She submitted the attorney's notes from the will signing, which included a standard competency assessment that Ruth had completed without issue. She submitted Clara's phone records going back 11 years, which showed not a strategic pattern of contact, but an unbroken weekly consistency that predated Ruth's decline in health by a decade. She submitted statements from Ruth's pastor, her doctor, and 2 neighbors who had known her for 30 years, and all of whom described a woman of exceptional mental clarity and independent judgment who had made her own decisions about her own life with complete awareness and without interference. The petition was dismissed 4 months after it was filed. There were 2 smaller challenges after that, one from a distant cousin Clara had met twice in her life, and one from a former neighbor who claimed Ruth had verbally promised her a piece of the sewing machine cabinet. Both were resolved without significant drama. The former cousin had no legal standing. The former neighbor's claim dissolved when Patricia Lord noted that verbal promises did not supersede legally executed testamentary documents, particularly when the alleged promise could not be corroborated by any other party. By the time the estate was fully settled, Clara had been living in the house on Calloway Street for 7 months. She had fixed the roof, not with a tarp and weighted shingles, but with a proper repair performed by a roofing company that came out on a Tuesday and finished by Thursday, and left behind a surface that would last 30 years. She had replaced the furnace. She had replumbed the kitchen, which had needed it for longer than anyone had admitted. She had painted the interior in colors she chose herself, warm and unhurried, the kind of colors that made a house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She had replaced nothing she didn't need to replace. She had kept the linoleum in the kitchen because it was the same floor she had walked on as a child, and she wanted to keep walking on it. She had kept the pale yellow walls in Ruth's bedroom because she could not see a reason to change something that was already exactly right. She had enrolled Maisie and Jonah in schools in Greensboro. Maisie had taken to her new school with the immediate ease of a child who trusts people until given a reason not to. Jonah had taken 2 months longer, which was his nature, careful and deliberate. But by March, he had a group of 3 friends he called by nickname, and a teacher who had identified him as exceptional at mathematics and was pushing him accordingly. He came home one evening in March and told Clara that his teacher had said he should think about an advanced program in the fall. Clara said she thought that was an excellent idea and asked him how he felt about it. He said he felt like it sounded hard. She said most things that were worth doing sounded hard first. He thought about that for a moment and then said, "It sounded like something Grandma Ruth would say, Clara said, "It is." The sale of the collection was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over the better part of a year, managed jointly by Patricia Lord and a specialist broker recommended by Dr. Price, a woman named Helen Vance, who operated from New York and London, and who had built her career specifically on the private sale and auction placement of extraordinary gemological assets. Helen Vance was small and brisk and spoke in the shorthand of someone whose time was genuinely limited and who had no patience for anything that wasn't the matter at hand. The first time Clara met her in a hotel conference room in Charlotte, Helen had looked at Dr. Price's report for approximately 90 seconds, and then looked at Clara and said, "Do you want speed or do you want value?" Clara said she wanted value. Helen nodded as if this was the correct answer and the only acceptable one, and opened her laptop. The diamonds went first, sold privately to 3 different institutional buyers over the course of 4 months. The largest stones placed individually with collectors in Geneva, Hong Kong, and New York, who had been waiting for stones of this caliber. The colored stones followed in 2 lots, the rubies and sapphires placed at auction through a major house in London, where they attracted the kind of competitive bidding that Helen Vance described afterward as spirited, which Clara understood to mean that people who rarely showed visible emotion had raised their paddles more than once. The Burmese rubies in particular drew attention beyond what the catalog description had suggested. One of the 3, a 4.8 carat stone of exceptional pigeon blood color, sold for 11 times its estimated reserve. The pearls were last. Helen had argued, carefully and respectfully, that this was the right order, because the pearl market was more particular than the diamond or colored stone markets, and because the 12.4 millimeter specimen, the one Ruth had paid $11,000 for in 1994, the one Dr. Price had described as among the finest he had examined in 31 years, deserved to be placed at exactly the right moment with exactly the right audience. The right moment came in the spring. The right audience was a specialized natural pearl auction at a house in London that held this particular sale once every 2 years and attracted collectors and institutions from 30 countries. Helen submitted the 12.4 millimeter specimen for inclusion and sent Clara the catalog description when the proofs arrived. It occupied a full page. The photography alone conveyed what words could not entirely capture: the way the pearl held light not on its surface, but inside it. The way its nacre was so dense and so perfectly deposited that it seemed not to reflect, but to emanate. The catalog note described it as a specimen of exceptional rarity, representing the finest qualities of natural saltwater cultivation, achieved over an extended period in ideal conditions, noting that stones of this caliber appeared at auction only a handful of times per decade. It sold for $2.1 million. Clara was sitting in the back room when Helen called to tell her. She was sitting at the sewing machine, not working it, just sitting beside it in the way she had started doing in the evenings sometimes, the way you sit beside a person you want to be close to. She was reading one of Ruth's tailoring books, a technical text on the history of European couture construction that she had been working through slowly, not because she needed it for any practical purpose, but because Ruth had kept it for a reason, and she wanted to know what the reason was. When her phone rang and Helen told her the number, Clara closed the book and set it on the work table and looked at the machine and said thank you. Helen said, "On the contrary, it's remarkable provenance. Your aunt had exceptional taste." Clara said, "Yes." She did. By the time the final settlement was complete, and the collection had been fully sold, and the proceeds had cleared, and the trust Patricia Lord had established was properly funded and operational, the total figure stood at $263,420,000, higher than the original appraisal, higher than Dr. Price's independent assessment, driven upward by a market that had moved favorably in the period between Ruth's valuation 4 years earlier and the completion of the sales process, and by a handful of exceptional stones that outperformed even expert projections when placed in the right rooms in front of the right people at the right time. So Clara sat with that number for several days before it began to feel real. Not the arithmetic of it. The arithmetic was clear and documented, and she had read every settlement statement with the careful attention she brought to all paperwork now. But the reality of it, the way it existed in her actual life and not just on the documents in her folder. She had been a woman with $43 for so long that the transition required a kind of internal recalibration that was not instantaneous. She moved through her days the same way, still woke early, still made coffee before anything else, still sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her pen, and wrote her list of what came next. The habits of a careful woman did not dissolve when the need for them diminished. They just meant something different. She paid off the mortgage on the house on Calloway Street, which was straightforward. She established education funds for Maisie and Jonah, fully funded, with the kind of numbers that meant neither of them would ever have to choose between what they wanted to study and what they could afford. She established a healthcare fund for both children that extended into adulthood, because she knew what it cost to live without that particular security, and she had decided they would not know it. She paid off the credit card debt she had been carrying for 3 years in the careful minimum payment way of someone managing cash flow. The debt that she had always thought of as temporary, but that had started to feel permanent in the way things do when you cannot see a clear path past them. She paid it in a single transaction and felt a specific lightness when she did, the kind that was entirely physical, a loosening in her chest and shoulders she had not realized was constant until it was gone. She hired 2 people, a financial advisor who worked exclusively with the trust Patricia Lord had established, a man with a long record of conservative, sustainable management, because Ruth had built the collection slowly and responsibly over 40 years, and Clara intended to manage what came from it with the same quality of judgment. And a second attorney, a specialist in philanthropy and nonprofit structure, because there was something else she wanted to do with what she had, and she needed the architecture to do it correctly. She had been thinking about the textile factory in Greensboro since the first week she moved into the house, when she had found Ruth's old employee ID from the factory in the back of a kitchen drawer, a small laminated card with a photograph of Ruth at 24, her expression patient and unremarkable against the plain background of an ID photo. The factory had closed in 1991, and the building had been vacant since then, a large industrial space on the eastern edge of the city that the county had been trying to repurpose for years without success, too expensive to renovate, too significant historically to demolish without objection, sitting in the particular limbo of abandoned structures that are too important to erase and too costly to restore. Clara drove to the site on a Tuesday afternoon in May. She parked in front of it and sat in the car and looked at the building for 20 minutes. It was large and plain, and its windows were boarded in a way that had become weathered enough to look permanent. The brick was original and intact, solid construction from an era that had built things to last. There were pigeons on the roof, and weeds along the foundation, and a chain-link fence along the front that was rusted but still standing. She got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk and looked at it the way Ruth had looked at stones, not at what it was right now, but at what it could be if someone applied the right knowledge and the right patience to it. She called the attorney who handled the county's economic development office and asked about the property. He called back the same afternoon, when she told him she was interested in a purchase and a full restoration, and that she had a specific use in mind. He said the county would be extremely receptive to any viable plan for the site. She said she imagined they would be, and that she would have a proposal for him within 60 days. The proposal took 45 days. She wrote most of it herself at the kitchen table, in the same notebook she had been writing in since the beginning, and then had it reviewed and formalized by the attorney and the philanthropy specialist. It described a working facility that would house a vocational training program for women in textile craft, specifically sewing, tailoring, pattern drafting, and fabric construction. They're taught by working professionals and organized to provide participants with both marketable skills and direct pathways to employment or independent business. The facility would also include a small working museum on the history of the Greensboro textile industry, the workers who had built it, the labor it had represented, the knowledge it had accumulated and lost when the factories closed. The museum would open with a permanent installation dedicated to Ruth Calloway. She did not name the facility after herself. She named it the Calloway Center. The county approved the purchase within 3 weeks. The restoration took 14 months. Clara was involved in every stage, and not in a supervisory way, but in the way of someone who had been raised by a woman who believed that the best way to understand how something was built was to be present while it was being built. She walked the floors with the architects and the contractors. She sat in planning meetings and asked questions that sometimes surprised people with their specificity. She had been reading. She had been reading the way Ruth read, everything she could find, on industrial preservation and vocational education, and workforce development, in the same methodical, self-directed way that Ruth had read about gemology for 2 years before she bought her first stone. On the day the Calloway Center opened, the building was clean and warm and full of light. The windows that had been boarded for 30 years had been restored to their original proportions and filled with the kind of industrial glass that let in the quality of natural light that serious textile work required. The workroom floors were wide plank oak, refinished but not replaced, because they were original to the building, and Clara had decided that original meant something. Along one wall, 30 sewing machines were arranged in 2 long rows, new equipment chosen for quality and durability, but placed in the kind of deliberate, organized configuration she recognized from the back room on Calloway Street. In the center of the room, on its own table, positioned beneath the best natural light in the building, was Ruth's machine. Not a replica. The original on its original cabinet, its lacquer and its scrollwork unchanged, its lower compartment empty and permanently open to show what it had once held. The museum installation was the last thing completed before the opening. It ran along the north wall of the facility in a long corridor that had been restored to the same brick and timber of the original structure. The installation traced the history of the Greensboro textile industry from its industrial beginnings through its peak and its closure, documenting the labor and the knowledge and the lives of the people who had made it. At its center, in a case of museum-quality glass, was Ruth's employee ID, the laminated card with the photograph of the 24-year-old woman with the patient expression and the whole of her life ahead of her. Beside it, on a clean white panel, the text Clara had written herself, in the same precise language Ruth had used for everything she considered important. Ruth Calloway worked in this building for 11 years. She learned her craft here and spent the following decades practicing it, alone and without recognition, with exceptional skill and unwavering dedication. In the years she worked at this machine, she also built something else, something patient and private and extraordinary, that no one knew about because she did not tell them. She kept it close to her most important tool. She left it to someone she trusted. This center is what that trust made possible. On the morning of the opening, before the doors were open to the public, Clara walked through the building alone. She walked slowly, the way she had learned to walk through spaces that mattered, looking at everything rather than moving past it. She stood in the workroom and looked at the 30 machines in their rows, and the light coming through the windows, and Ruth's machine on its table in the center. And she felt the particular emotion of someone standing inside something they built that they didn't expect to be able to build. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than pride. The feeling of having honored something correctly. She stood at Ruth's machine and put her hands on its iron body. The metal was cool under her palms, the same temperature it always was, absorbing nothing and reflecting everything. She ran her fingers along the scrollwork, the gilded lines she had traced on her first night of discovery, and she thought about Ruth sitting here, decade after decade, the machine running, and the cabinet beside her keeping its secret. And she thought about the patience that required, and the faith that required, the faith that someone would come, eventually, who would look twice. The doors opened at 10 in the morning. 53 women enrolled in the first cohort of the training program, ranging from 19 to 61 years old, from Greensboro and the surrounding counties, drawn by outreach that had been modest and word of mouth that had not been. Some of them had sewing experience, some had none. Some had lost jobs in other industries and were starting over. Some had never had the opportunity to start at all. They filed in through the main doors and found their stations in the workroom and sat down at the machines and looked around at the space that had been built for them. And Clara stood at the back of the room and watched their faces and felt something she could not have predicted and would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't been in the parking lot with $43. She felt what Ruth had left her, not just the collection, not just the money, not just the house and its contents, and the 40 years of quiet accumulation. She felt the full weight of what it meant to be the person someone had trusted with the most important thing they had built. She felt the responsibility of that, which was not heavy in the way of burdens, but substantial in the way of foundations, something you stood on rather than something you carried. Dennis sent a letter through his attorney in the month the Calloway Center opened. It was not a legal challenge this time. It was a personal letter, which surprised her, and it was not gracious exactly, but it was honest in a way that surprised her more. He wrote that he had read the newspaper coverage of the center's opening, and that he wanted to say he understood now why Ruth had made the decision she made, and that he wasn't at peace with it, entirely, but that he could see what she had done with it, and that Ruth would have been satisfied. He did not apologize for the months of pressure and the legal challenge, but he also did not ask for anything. The letter ended with a statement that took her 2 readings to understand, as the admission it was. "I didn't know what she had," he wrote. "I don't think any of us did." She thought that was probably the truest thing Dennis had ever said to her. She wrote back, not a long letter. She kept it short in the way Ruth kept things short when a few words would do. She told him that Ruth had understood what she was doing for her whole life, and that the best way to honor that was to do something worth doing with what she left behind, and that she hoped, in time, the family would find their way to seeing the center for what it was, which was not Clara's statement of victory, but Ruth's. She sealed the envelope and mailed it, and did not wait for a response. Maisie visited the center on a Saturday in the fall of that first year. She had been asking to come since before it opened, with the particular persistence she brought to things she had decided were important. Clara took her on a quiet Saturday morning before the workroom filled up, and Maisie walked through the space with the same concentrated attention she gave to everything that interested her, which was considerable. She stopped at each machine and looked at it carefully. She stopped longest at Ruth's machine, studying the scrollwork and the lacquer and the open compartment at the base of the cabinet. She asked what the compartment was for. Clara told her. She told her the whole story, standing beside the machine in the light. The full story from the parking lot to the letter, to the discovery, to the diamonds in her palm, to the pearl, and what it sold for, and the Calloway Center and all of it. And Maisie listened with the stillness of a child who understands that something is being given to her, not just told. When Clara finished, Maisie was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "How did Grandma Ruth know it would be you?" Clara thought about the Sunday phone calls and the hospital waiting rooms and the holidays and the way she had always come, not strategically, not with any awareness that coming was something that would matter in the way it did, but simply because Ruth was Ruth, and you came because you wanted to be there. She thought about the note. Don't let anyone rush you. She thought about the years of being told that what she had was not enough, and the woman who had always said, from the beginning, keep going. She said, I think she knew, because she had spent 40 years watching who paid attention, and the people who paid attention were the people who showed up. Maisie looked at the machine. She said, Can I try it? Clara sat down and pulled a chair up beside her and threaded the machine the way she had learned to thread it that first afternoon in the back room on Calloway Street. And Maisie's small hands guided a strip of fabric through in slightly crooked lines that were exactly the right kind of crooked for a first attempt, and the machine made its quiet, steady sound in the workroom of the building that Ruth had worked in at 24 years old, and that now stood restored and full of light on the east side of a city that had forgotten it had ever mattered. In the spring of the following year, Clara was asked to give a talk at a women's business conference in Raleigh. She almost declined. She had given no interviews about the discovery, had issued only a brief statement through Patricia Lord's office at the time of the estate settlement, so had let the newspaper coverage of the Calloway Center speak for itself. She was not a person who sought visibility. She was a person who sought to do the work correctly. But the woman who invited her said something in her email that Clara thought about for 3 days before responding. She said, There are a lot of women who are standing in a parking lot right now. They need to hear from someone who is standing there too. She accepted. She stood at the lectern in a hotel conference room in Raleigh in front of 400 women, and she told the story simply and without embellishment, because it did not need embellishment, because the truth of it was already more extraordinary than anything embellishment could add. She told it the way Ruth had written her letter, precisely, without sentiment, letting the facts carry the weight. She told them about the $43 and the electric bill and the cereal for dinner and the will that had surprised everyone and the sewing machine that her cousin had said was worthless. She told them about the note in the drawer and the panel that moved and the leather pouches in the compartment and the cold weight of diamonds in her palm. She told them about Patricia Lord and Dr. Price and Helen Vance and the pearl that sold for $2.1 million because a woman in Greensboro had paid $11,000 for it in 1994 because she understood what she was buying. She told them about the Calloway Center, about the 53 women in the first cohort, about Maisie at the machine in slightly crooked lines. And then she said the thing she had been thinking about since the day she found Ruth's letter, the thing that Ruth had said in the letter and that she had been learning the meaning of ever since. She said, My aunt spent 40 years building something extraordinary in complete silence. Not because she was hiding it from the world, but because she understood that the things most worth building are the things that don't need an audience while they're being built. She built it one stone at a time with knowledge she had gathered herself, and patience she had developed herself, and judgment she trusted because she had earned the right to trust it. She left it to someone who had been paying attention, and the only reason I was the person who paid attention is that I showed up. That's the whole story. That's all of it. She showed up for me for my whole life, and I showed up for her. And when she was gone, she left me everything she had built. Not because I was the most deserving person in the room, but because I was the one who came. There was quiet in the room when she finished. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but fullness. The kind that settles over an audience when they have heard something they already knew, but had not yet heard said. She drove home to Greensboro that evening, along a highway she had driven 100 times. The windows were down, and the spring air came through and smelled of new grass and distance, and the particular smell of a season beginning. She thought about Ruth in the back room at 9 in the morning, the machine running, the cabinet beside her, the light coming through the window the way it always came through that window, and she felt the quiet, unspecific comfort of a woman who understood where she came from and what she was carrying forward and why it mattered. She thought about what she would say if she could say anything to Ruth now. She thought about it for a long time, and she could not find words that were adequate to what she wanted to say, which was that she understood now the full dimension of the gift, that it had not been the stones or the money or even the house, though all of those things had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. The real gift had been the example. The 40 years of showing up at the machine and doing the work and building the thing that no one could see and trusting that the right person would find it. The example of a woman who had believed, without requiring confirmation from anyone, that what she was building was worth building, and who had lived her whole life according to that belief. That was the inheritance, not the diamonds, not the pearls, not the $263 million. The belief that the work was worth doing, the patience to keep going, the trust that the person who paid attention would find what you left. Clara pulled off the highway at her exit and drove the familiar streets toward the house on Calloway Street, where the lights were on in the kitchen because Jonah had gotten home from his advanced program and was making something on the stove that he would describe as dinner, and that would probably require her input, and where Maisie was likely in the back room at the sewing machine, practicing her slightly crooked lines, learning the names of things the way Clara had learned them, on sitting beside someone who knew them, and letting the knowledge pass between them the way knowledge passes between people who share a quiet understanding of each other. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment in the car with the windows down and the spring air coming through, and the lights of the house making warm rectangles on the yard. The house on Calloway Street, pale yellow inside, patched and plumbed and painted, and hers. The house Ruth had lived in alone for 30 years and left to the one person who had always come. She sat there and she felt complete in the particular way of someone who has arrived, not at an ending, but at a beginning. A real one. The kind with solid ground under it, and a clear idea of where to go, and enough of what you need to get there. Then she got out of the car and went inside. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.